The official death register in Richmond, Virginia, records Governor Fairmont's wife, Catherine Fairmont, as having died of natural causes in November of 1847. The matter on paper was closed, but documents sealed deep within the state archives for more than 100 years suggest a far more disturbing truth. They speak of 5 enslaved men housed in isolated quarters, their rooms linked by a network of underground corridors leading directly beneath the governor's mansion. They hint at a troubling pattern of unexplained pregnancies among the household staff, and they describe a sudden fire, one that consumed an entire wing of the estate just hours after Catherine Fairmont's body was found. In the weeks that followed her death, the Virginia General Assembly convened 3 emergency sessions behind closed doors. Every legislator present was required to sign a strict confidentiality oath, one so binding it was not scheduled to expire until 1947. No official record reveals what was discussed during those meetings. Yet over the decades, 7 personal diaries, each belonging to a different legislator, each discovered independently, refer to the same cryptic phrase, the arrangement in the East Wing. Before we continue unraveling the story of Catherine Fairmont and the secrets buried alongside her, take a moment to subscribe to Vintage Truths and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from, because what unfolded in Virginia was not unique. It was the inevitable result of power, isolation, and enforced silence colliding, and the truth those men carried, and the Fairmont family 10 generations trying to erase, did not begin with scandal or death, but with ambition, and with a young girl whose childhood would quietly shape the monster she would one day become. Catherine Henley was born in Richmond in 1812. The 3rd daughter of Edmund Henley, a tobacco merchant whose family had accumulated wealth and influence over 5 generations in Virginia. The Henley Mansion on Gray Street was one of the finest in Richmond, with imported furniture from England, crystal chandeliers from France, and a staff of 43 enslaved people who maintained the household with invisible efficiency. Catherine's childhood was one of privilege, but also of suffocating expectation. Her 2 older sisters had married well, one to a congressman, another to a plantation owner with holdings in 3 companies. Unties. Catherine was expected to do the same, to be beautiful, accomplished, obedient, and silent. She learned to play the piano, forte, to embroider, to speak French, to manage a household. She attended the finest finishing school in Richmond, where young ladies were taught that their purpose was to be ornaments to their future husbands, to produce heirs, and to never ever express an opinion on matters of substance. But Catherine was not like her sisters. She was intelligent, curious, and deeply resentful of the cage that society had built around her. She read books that were considered inappropriate for young ladies, philosophy, history, political theory. She listened at doors when her father entertained politicians and businessmen, absorbing conversations about power, money, and influence. And she watched with growing fascination and horror the absolute power that white people held over the enslaved people in her household. She was 12 years old when she first understood what that power meant. One of the housemaids, a girl named Rose, who was only a few years older than Catherine, had been caught stealing food from the kitchen. The punishment was swift and brutal. Rose was tied to the waist and whipped in the courtyard while the entire household staff was forced to watch. Catherine watched from her bedroom window, hidden behind the curtain, and felt something shift inside her. It wasn't horror at the violence, though she recognized that she should feel that it was something else entirely, a dark, thrilling realization that some people had the power to inflict pain and others had no choice but to endure it. She began to experiment with that power in small ways. She would give orders to the enslaved children who worked in the house, watching to see how far she could push them before they showed fear or resentment. She would report minor infractions to her mother, knowing that punishment would follow. She would create situations where enslaved people would fail at tasks, then watch as they were disciplined. Her mother noticed and was pleased. "You have a firm hand," she told Catherine approvingly. "That will serve you well when you manage your own household." Her father noticed too, but with less approval. There was something in Catherine's eyes when she exercised power that disturbed him, a coldness, a calculation that seemed unnatural in a young girl. But he said nothing. Girls were their mother's responsibility, and besides, a strong will could be useful in a wife as long as it was properly directed. Catherine grew into a beautiful young woman. She had auburn hair that caught the light like copper, green eyes that could appear warm or cold depending on her mood, and a figure that drew admiring glances from Richmond's young men. She was a comp, lished, charming, and perfectly trained in the art of being what men wanted to see. But beneath the surface, Catherine was seething with rage at the limitations placed on her. She watched her father make business decisions. Her brothers-in-law wield political influence, and she knew that she was smarter than most of them. But she would never be allowed to own property in her own name, to vote, to any legal existence separate from her father or future husband. In the eyes of the law, she was barely more than property herself. Valuable property, to be sure, but property nonetheless. The only power she would ever have was the power over those beneath her in the social hierarchy, and she intended to use it. Thomas Fairmont entered her life in 1830 when Catherine was 18. He was 32, a widowero. Whose first wife had died in childbirth along with the baby. He was handsome in a stern way, educated, ambitious, and looking for a wife who could help him navigate Richmond society as he built his political career. Catherine's father saw an excellent match. Fairmont owned a profitable plantation, had connections throughout Virginia, and was clearly destined for political success. Catherine saw an opportunity. She set out to make Thomas Fairmont fall in love with her, or at least to make him believe he had. She was charming, attentive, and careful to appear just intelligent enough to be interesting, but not so intelligent as to be threatening. She laughed at his jokes, asked thoughtful questions about his political ambitions, and presented herself as the perfect political wife, beautiful, accomplished, and completely devoted to supporting his career. They were married in June 1831 in a ceremony at St. John's Episcopal Church that was attended by everyone who mattered in Richmond society. Catherine was 19 years old, and she believed that marriage would give her the power and independence she craved. She was wrong. Thomas Fairmont was not a cruel husband by the standards of his TI. He provided well for Catherine, gave her a generous household allowance, and treated her with the distant courtesy that was considered appropriate between spouses of their class. But he also made it clear that she was to have no involvement in his business or political affairs, that her role was to manage the household and produce heirs, and that he expected her to be obedient and unquestioning. Catherine found herself in a new cage, one that was gilded and comfortable, but still a cage. She had traded her father's authority for her husband's and gained nothing in the process. The first few years of marriage were marked by disappointment and growing resentment. Catherine did not become pregnant, despite Thomas's regular visits to her bedroom, visits that were dutiful, brief, and entire. Lie focused on the production of an heir. She underwent examinations by doctors who poked and prodded her and declared that there was no obvious reason for her failure to conceive. The implication was clear. The fault was hers, and she was failing in her primary duty as a wife. Thomas never said anything directly, but Catherine could see the disappointment in his eyes, could hear the whispers at Sochi. Al gatherings, a wife who couldn't produce children was a failure, and Catherine had spent her entire life being told that failure was unacceptable. She began to withdraw from society, spending more time alone in the Fairmont Plantation house in Hanover County. Thomas was often in Richmond, attending to business and political matters, and Catherine was left to manage the household and the plantati, On's enslaved workforce. It was during this period of isolation that Catherine began to develop what would later become the arrangement. The Fairmont Plantation had over 100 enslaved people working the tobacco fields, maintaining the grounds, and running the household. Catherine, as mistress of the plantation, had absolute authority over all of them. She could order them to do anything, punish them for any reason or no reason at all, and no one would question her decisions. She began to exercise that power in increasingly disturbing ways. She would summon enslaved men to her sitting room and order them to stand for hours while she read or did needlework, watching them struggle to remain still, to hide their discomfort. She would create impossible tasks, ordering a room to be cleaned to perfection, then finding fault with invisible specks of dust and ordering it cleaned again. She would pit enslaved people against each other, rewarding one and punishing another for the same behavior, watching how they scrambled to please her, to avoid her displeasure. The enslaved people on the Fairmont plantation learned to fear Catherine in a way that was different from their fear of the overseer, or even of Thomas Fairmont himself. The overseers were brutal but predictable. If you worked hard and followed the rules, you could usually avoid the worst punishments. Thomas Fairmont was distant and largely indifferent as long as the plantation ran smoothly and produced profit. But Catherine was capricious, creative in her cruelty, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in exercising her power. He would smile while ordering punishments, speak in a soft, sweet voice while describing exactly how a transgression would be addressed. The enslaved people whispered that there was something wrong with her, something broken inside that made her enjoy their suffering. In 1838, Thomas Fairmont was elected governor of Virginia. It was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, and he was triumphant. He and Catherine moved to the governor's mansion in Richmond, a 3-story brick structure on Capitol Square that had housed Virginia's chief executive since 1813. Catherine was now the First Lady of Virginia, and she had access to power and influence that she had never had before. But she quickly discovered that even this elevated position came with constraints. She was expected to host, tease, attend charity events, smile at political dinners, and be the perfect ornament to her husband's career. She had no real power, no real authority, just a more elaborate cage. The governor's mansion employed a staff of 32 enslaved people, and Catherine immediately began to assert control over them. She reorganized the household, changed schedules, and made it clear that she expected absolute obedience and perfection. The staff, most of whom had worked in the mansion for years under previous governors, found themselves walking on eggshells, never sure what would displease the new mistress. But Catherine wanted more than just a well-run household. She wanted something that was entirely hers, a space where she had absolute control, where she could exercise power without any oversight or interference. In the spring of 1840, she conceived of the arrangement. The east wing of the governor's mansion housed Catherine's private apartments, a bedroom, a sitting room, a small library, and a dressing room. The rooms were spacious and well-appointed, with high ceilings, large windows, and fireplaces in every room. Directly beneath these rooms was a section of the basement that had been used for storage, old furniture, trunks of linens, boxes of papers from previous administrations. Catherine looked at that basement space and saw a possibility. She told Thomas that she wanted to renovate the basement beneath her apartments to create proper quarters for personal servants who would attend to her needs. It was an unusual request. Wealthy women often had enslaved people who worked exclusively for them. Thomas, busy with legislative sessions and political crises, approved the renovation without much thought. He gave Catherine a budget and told her to handle it as she saw fit. Catherine hired workers from outside Richmond, men who didn't know the Fairmont family and wouldn't gossip about the unusual specifications she provided. She wanted the basement divided into 5 separate rooms, each with a door that locked from the outside. She wanted each room furnished with an actual bed, not just a pallet on the floor along with a small table, a chair, and a lamp. She wanted a small kitchen area installed with a stove and storage for food. And she wanted a separate staircase built connecting the basement directly to her private sitting room so that she could access the basement quarters without going through the main house. The workers thought it was odd, but they were being paid well, and they had learned not to ask questions of wealthy clients. They completed the renovation in 6 weeks, and Catherine inspected every detail personally, making sure that everything was exactly as she had specified. Then she went to the Fairmont Plantation in Hanover County and selected 5 men from the enslaved workforce. She chose carefully. She didn't want field hands who would be too rough, too uneducated for her purposes. She wanted men who had been trained for household work, men who could read and write, men who were intelligent enough to understand what was expected of them and desperate enough to comply. Marcus was 28, a skilled carpenter who had built furniture for the Plantation house. He was tall and strong, with careful hands and a quiet demeanor. He had a wife and 2 children on the plantation, and he lived in constant fear that they would be sold away. James was 26, light-skinned enough that rumors circulated about his parentage. He had worked in the plantation house since he was a boy, serving meals and maintaining the rooms. He could read and write, skills that made him valuable but also dangerous. Literate slaves were always watched more carefully, always suspected of planning escape or rebellion. William was 30, a blacksmith who had been trained by his father. He was powerfully built with arms like tree trunks from years of working the forge. He had tried to run away once when he was younger and had been caught and whipped so severely that he still beat, or the scars across his back. The experience had broken something in him, and he had been docile ever since, going through life with the mechanical obedience of a man who had given up hope. Daniel was 24, the youngest of the group. He had been taught to read and write by a previous owner who had believed in improving his slaves. He was intelligent, curious, and still had enough spirit left to fee. Anger at his situation, though he had learned to hide it behind a mask of compliance. Samuel was 29, trained as a personal valet. He knew how to care for fine clothing, how to shave a man without nicking the skin, how to move through a room without being noticed. He had the invisible quality that was prized in personal servants, the ability to be present but not intrusive, to anticipate needs. Why? Without being told, Catherine had each of them brought to her sitting room at the plantation one at a time and explained what she wanted. "You're being transferred to Richmond," she told them. "You'll work in the governor's mansion in my private quarters. You'll have your own rooms, good food, light work. But you must understand that you belong to me completely. You will do exactly as I say when I say it without question. If you obey, you'll be treated well. If you disobey, or if you ever speak to anyone about what happens in the East Wing, you'll be sold to the Deep South, to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where slaves last an average of 7 years before they work themselves to death. Do you understand?" Each man understood. They had no choice but to understand. In the world they lived in, enslaved people had no rights, no recourse, no way to refuse an order from their owner. They could only obey and hope to survive. In May 1840, the 5 men were transported to Richmond and installed in the basement quarters beneath Catherine's apartments. The door at the top of the private staircase was fitted with a heavy lock, and Catherine kept the only key on a chain around her neck. The arrangement had begun. For the first few weeks, Catherine's demands were relatively benign. She would summon one of the men to her sitting room and have him tend the fire or move furniture or read aloud from a book while she did needlework. She was testing them, watching to see how they responded to her orders, how quickly they obeyed, whether they showed any signs of resistance or resentment. They learned quickly that absolute obedience was the only way to avoid punishment. Catherine had a system of rewards and punishments that was both calculated and capricious. A man who pleased her might receive extra food or a warmer blanket or a few hours of freedom to walk in the mansion gardens under supervision. A man who displeased her by moving too slowly or failing to anticipate her needs or showing any hint of independent thought would be locked in his room without food, or forced to stand in the cold basement for hours, or subjected to other creative torments that left no visible marks, but inflicted psychological torture. The other servants in the mansion noticed that something strange was happening in the East Wing, but they didn't understand the full scope of it. They noticed that, Catherine spent most of her time in her private apartments, rarely emerging except for official functions. They noticed that the 5 men from the basement were never seen in the main house, that they seemed to exist in a separate world entirely. They noticed that food sent to the East Wing was different and more abundant than what was served elsewhere in the mansion. Martha, the head cook, was first to voice her concerns. She was a middle-aged woman who had been enslaved in the governor's mansion for over 20 years, serving under 4 different governors. She had seen a lot in her time, but she had never seen anything quite like Catherine Fairmont's arrangement. "Something ain't right in that East Wing," she told her daughter Bess, who worked as a housemaid. "Mrs. Fairmont, she's got those. 5 men locked up down there like prisoners, and the food she wants me to send up, it's like she's feeding guests. Not slaves. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, wine from the cellar. What's she doing with them?" Bess had noticed other things. She had been in the hallway outside the East Wing late one evening, carrying fresh linens to the guest rooms, when she heard voices coming from behind the closed doors. Not the voice of a mistress giving orders to slaves, but something else, low, intimate, almost conversational. And once, when she had passed by the door to the basement stairs, she had heard something that sounded like crying, a man's voice breaking with sobs. "Maybe we should tell someone," Bess whispered to her mother. "Maybe we should tell the governor." Martha shook her head firmly. "Tell him what? That his wife is acting strange? That she keeps slaves in her private quarters? That ain't illegal, child. She owns those men. She can do what she wants with them. And if we go making accusations without proof, we'll be the ones who suffer. Mrs. Fairmont, she'd have us sold away before we could blink. No, we keep our heads down and our mouths shut. That's how we survive." But Martha could shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in the East Wing, something that went beyond the normal cruelties of slavery. She began to pay closer attention, to watch and listen and remember. In the basement quarters, the 5 men were learning the true nature of Catherine's arrangement. It started with Marcus. Catherine summoned him to her sitting room one afternoon in late June A.B. About 6 weeks after they had arrived in Richmond, she was wearing a silk dressing gown and her hair was unpinned, falling in waves around her shoulders. She told Marcus to tend the fire, and he did, kneeling by the fireplace and adding logs, arranging them so they would burn evenly. When he finished and stood to leave, Catherine told him to wait. "Come here," she said, her voice soft but commanding. Marcus approached, his eyes downcast, his heart pounding. He had learned to read Catherine's moods, and there was something in her voice that frightened him. Catherine reached out and touched his face, running her fingers along his jaw. Marcus flinched but didn't pull away. He knew that any sign of resistance would be punished. "You're afraid of me," Catherine said, and she smiled. "Good. You should be. But if you do exactly as I say, I won't hurt you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mom," Marcus whispered. What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Catherine used him, treated him not as a person, but as an object for her gratification. And when she was finished, she sent him back to the basement with a warning that if he ever spoke of what had happened, she would have his wife and children sold to the Deep South, and he would never see them again. Marcus stumbled down the stairs to the basement. His mind reeling, his body shaking, he locked himself in his room and wept, great racking sobs that he tried to muffle with his pillow so the other men wouldn't hear, but they heard anyway, and over the following weeks and months, each of them would experience the same tea.
Catherine would summon them one by one, use them for her pleasure, and send them back to the basement with threats and warnings that ensured their silence.
The 5 men existed in a nightmare from which there was no escape. They were locked in the basement at night with no way to leave, even if they wanted to. During the day, they were at Catherine's constant beck and call, never knowing when. They would be summoned, what would be demanded of them, how long they would be kept. They were fed well and housed in relative comfort. But they were prisoners, subjected to abuses that they had no way to resist or report. They couldn't tell the other slaves in the mansion because Catherine had made it clear that anyone who spoke of the arrangement would be punished. Not just the man who spoke, his family, his friends, anyone he cared about. They couldn't tell Governor Fairmont because who would believe enslaved men accusing the governor's wife? And even if someone did believe them, what could be done? Catherine owned them. She had the legal right to do whatever she wanted with her property. They were trapped and they knew it. Daniel, the youngest and most educated of the five, tried to find some way to cope with the situation. He had been taught to read and write, and he had always believed that education was the path to freedom, or at least to a better life. But now he found that his literacy was just another tool for Catherine to exploit. She would have him read to her for hours, not because she enjoyed the stories, but because she enjoyed having him perform for her watchin'. She him struggled to keep his voice steady while she lounged on her settee, sipping wine and studying him with those cold green eyes. Sometimes she would ask him questions about what he was reading, testing his comprehension, and if his answers didn't satisfy her, she would punish him, not with violence, but with isolation. She would lock him in his basement room for days with only bread and water, and he would sit in the darkness and wonder if he was going mad. William, the blacksmith, retreated into himself. He had already been broken once, when he had tried to run away and been caught and whipped. Now he was being broken again in a different way, and he didn't have the strength to resist. He moved through his days like a ghost, doing what he was told, feeling nothing, thinking nothing. It was the only way he could survive. James, who had always been quiet and careful, tried to make himself invisible. He learned to anticipate Catherine's needs before she voiced them, to move silently, to never meet her eyes, to be as unobtrusive as possible. He thought that if he could just be perfect, if he could just avoid displeasing her, maybe she would leave him alone. But Catherine didn't want perfection. She wanted power, and power required someone to dominate. Samuel, the valet, tried a different approach. He tried to please Catherine, to give her what she wanted before she had to demand it, to make himself valuable enough that she would treat him better. It didn't work. Catherine didn't want a willing participant. She wanted submission, fear, absolute control. Samuel's attempts to please her only seemed to irritate her, and she punished him more frequently than the others, as if his compliance was an insult to her authority. Marcus the carpenter was the one who suffered most visibly. He had a wife and children on the plantation, and the thought of them kept him alive, but also tortured him. He knew that Catherine used his family as leverage, that any resistance on his part would result in their being sold away. He was trapped between his love for his family and his horror at what he was being forced to endure, and the conflict was tearing him apart. The other slaves in the mansion watched the 5 men deteriorate and whispered among themselves. They didn't know exactly what was happening in the East Wing, but they could see the effects. The 5 men grew thin despite the good food. Their eyes became hollow, their movements mechanical. They rarely spoke even to each other, and when they did, their voices were flat, emotionless. Mrs. Dawes, the free black housekeeper, was deeply troubled by what she observed. She had worked in wealthy households for most of her adult life, and she had seen the many ways that enslaved people were abused. But there was something about the situation in the East Wing that was different, something that went beyond the usual cruelties. She began to keep a diary written in careful script and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. She recorded dates, times, observations. She noted when Catherine summoned each of the 5 men, how long they stayed in the East Wing, what condition they were in when they emerged. She didn't know what she would do with this information, but she felt compelled to document it, to bear witness to something that everyone else was trying to ignore. In February 1841, something happened that made the situation even more disturbing. One of the housemates, a young woman named Patience, began showing signs of pregnancy. This wasn't unusual in itself. Enslaved women were frequently subjected to sexual
Violence and pregnancy was a common result. But when Mrs. Dawes asked Patience who the father was, the girl's reaction was extreme.
Patience became hysterical, sobbing and shaking, begging Mrs. Dawes not to ask, not to tell anyone. She made me. Patience finally gasped, Mrs. Fairmont made me go down there. She watched. She told me what to do. Please, please don't tell anyone. They'll sell me south. They'll separate me from my mother. Mrs. Dawes was horrified. She tried to get more information, but Patience was too terrified to say anything else. The girl was convinced that if anyone found out what had happened, she would be punished, sold away, separated from everyone she loved. Mrs. Dawes faced an impossible dilemma. She was free, yes, but her freedom was precarious. She worked for the go. Werner of Virginia, and if she made accusations against his wife without proof, she would lose her position, her reputation, possibly her freedom itself. And if what Patience was suggesting was true, that Catherine Fairmont was forcing enslaved women to have sexual encounters with the men in the basement and watching while it happened, who would believe it? It was too monstrous, too depraved. Peep. Leigh would think Mrs. Dawes was lying or mad or trying to cause trouble. She decided to say nothing but to watch even more carefully. Over the next year, 2 more housemaids became pregnant under similar circumstances. Both refused to name the fathers. Both exhibited the same terror when questioned, and both, Mrs. Dawes noticed, had been seen entering the east wing late at night and emerging hours later disheveled and weeping. Mrs. Dawes added these observations to her diary, along with her growing suspicion about what Catherine was doing. It seemed that Catherine wasn't content with using the 5 men for her own gratification. She was also orchestrating encounters between them and the enslaved women in the household, treating human beings like livestock, breeding them for her own amusement. Or some twisted psychological need? The 5 men in the basement knew what was happening, but they were powerless to stop it. When Catherine would summon one of them and bring a terrified housemaid down to the basement, they had no choice but to comply. Refusal would mean punishment, not just for them, but for the women who would be blamed for the men's disobedience. It was a level of depravity that went beyond anything they had experienced before. They were being used not just for Catherine's pleasure, but as instruments of her power over others. They were being forced to participate in the violation of women who were just as trapped and powerless as they were. Daniel, who still had some spark of resistance left in him, tried once to refuse. Catherine had brought a young housemaid to the basement, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, and ordered Daniel to take her into his room. Daniel looked at the girl's terrified face and said, "No." Catherine's expression didn't change. She simply said, "Very well," and sent the girl away. Then she had Daniel locked in his room for a week with no food, only water. When she finally let him out, she brought the same girl back and repeated her order. This time Daniel obeyed. He had learned that resistance was futile, that it only resulted in prolonged suffering for everyone involved. It was better to comply quickly and get it over with, to try to be as gentle as possible with the women who were forced into the basement, to whisper apologies that meant nothing but were all he had to offer. The psychological toll on all 5 men was devastating. They were being forced to participate in their own degradation and the degradation of others, and there was no escape, no relief, no hope. They existed in a state of constant fear and shame, knowing that what was happening was wrong, but unable to stop it. Marcus began to have nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, gasping and sweating, haunted by images of his wife and children being dragged away in chains. He stopped eating, lost weight, developed a tremor in his hands that made it difficult to do the carpentry work that had once been his pride. James retreated further into silence. He stopped speaking entirely unless directly addressed, and even then his responses were monosyllabic. He moved through the mansion like a shadow, and the other slaves began to avoid him, disturbed by the emptiness in his eyes. William's earlier resignation deepened into something like catatonia. He would stand for hours without moving, staring at nothing, and had to be physically prompted to perform even simple tasks. Daniel's anger, which he had tried so hard to suppress, began to leak out in small ways. He would clench his fists until his nails drew blood, would mutter under His breath, when he thought no one was listening, would sometimes look at Catherine with such hatred that even she noticed and punished him for his insolence. Samuel developed a nervous habit of picking at his skin, creating small wounds on his arms and hands that never quite healed because he couldn't stop worrying at them. The other slaves in the mansion noticed these changes and whispered Amon.
Gee, themselves, something terrible was happening in the East Wing. Something that was destroying these 5 men from the inside out. But no one knew what to do about it.
And so they did nothing. Governor Fairmont, meanwhile, was oblivious to what was happening in his own house. He was consumed with his political career, with legislative battles and party politics and the constant maneuvering requie. Read to maintain power in Virginia's fractious political landscape. He rarely saw his wife accept at official functions, and when he did, she was always perfectly composed, charming, the ideal political spouse. He had long since stopped visiting Catherine's bedroom. Their marriage had become one of convenience and appearance, and both of them seemed content with that arrangement. Thomas had his political career and his business interests, and Catherine had whatever it was she did in the East Wing. He didn't ask, and she didn't tell. In the spring of 1842, Catherine made an announcement that shocked everyone. She was pregnant. Thomas was overjoyed. After 11 years of marriage, he had given up hope of having an heir. He threw a celebration dinner, invited Richmond's elite, and toasted his wife. Health with champagne imported from France. He was attentive and solicitous, asking after Catherine's health, making sure she had everything she needed. Catherine accepted his attention with gracious smiles and appropriate modesty. She glowed with health and satisfaction, and Richmond society congratulated her warmly. Finally, the governor would have an heir. Finally, Catherine had fulfilled her primary duty as a wife. But the servants in the mansion knew something that the governor didn't. Catherine had not shared her husband's bed in over a year. Joseph, the governor's elderly valet, had mentioned this to Mrs. Dorrs months earlier. The governor sleeps in his own chambers. Joseph had said has done for more than a year now, says his wife needs her rest, that she's delicate. But if they AI in sharing a bed, how is she pregnant? Mrs. Dawes had no answer, but she had her suspicions. She had seen Catherine summon Marcus to the East Wing with increasing frequency over the past year. She had seen the way Catherine looked at Marcus with a possessive intensity that was disturbing, and she remembered that Marcus was tall and strong with dark hair and blue eyes, features that could easily be passed off as inherited from the Fairmont or Henley families. Catherine's pregnancy progressed normally. She continued to spend most of her time in the East Wing, claiming that she needed rest and quiet. She continued to summon the 5 men from the basement, though less frequently as her pregnancy advanced, and she seemed happier than she had been in years, as if the pregnancy had given her so.
She had been desperately seeking.
In November 1842, Catherine gave birth to a son. The delivery was attended by Richmond's finest physician and 2 midwives, and it went smoothly. The baby was healthy with a lusty cry and a strong grip. He was named Thomas Fairmont, Jr., and the governor was beside himself with pride and joy. Richmond society celebrated the birth with parties and gifts and congratulatory visits. The newspapers printed announcements. The baby was christened at St. John's Episcopal Church in a ceremony attended by Virginia's political elite. Thomas Fairmont had an heir, and the Fairmont legacy was secure. But Mrs. Dorrs, who had seen the baby when the wet nurse brought him to the kitchen for warm milk, noticed something that made her blood run cold. The baby had a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, a dark crescent-shaped mark about the size of a thumbprint. She had seen that exact birthmark before on Marcus's left shoulder, visible when he had rolled up his sleeves to carry firewood. Mrs. Dorr said nothing. What could she say? That the governor's son might be the child of an enslaved man. It was unthinkable. It was dangerous. It was a secret that could get everyone in the household killed. But she wrote it in her diary, dated and detailed, and hid the book away. In the basement quarters, Marcus knew the truth. Catherine had told him with cruel satisfaction that the child was his. She had used him to produce the heir that she couldn't produce with her husband, and now she had proof of her power. A child who would inherit the Fairmont fortune and name. A child who carried Marcus's blood but would never know his true father. Marcus was devastated. He had a son, but that son would grow up as a white child, as the governor's heir, as a slave owner. His son would never know him, would never know the truth. And Marcus would have to watch from a distance, unable to claim his child, unable to protect him, unable to do anything but serve the Wuma, who had stolen his child and his life. The knowledge broke something fundamental in Marcus. He had endured the abuse, the captivity, the forced encounters with terrified women. He had endured it all because he had his wife and children on the plantation, because he had hoped that somehow, someday, things might get better. But now he had a son who would never be his, and the weight of that loss was
more than he could bear.
He began to deteriorate rapidly. He stopped eating almost entirely, became gaunt and hollow-eyed. His hands shook constantly. He would sometimes stand in his basement room and weep for hours, great silent sobs that shook his whole body. The other 4 men watched him with growing alarm, but they didn't know how to help him. They were all trapped in the same nightmare, all this
Suffering in their own ways.
Catherine noticed Marcus's decline, but she didn't care. She had what she wanted, a son, an heir, proof of her power. Marcus had served his purpose, and if he was falling apart, well, she could always replace him with another man from the plantation. The years that followed were marked by a strange, tense normalcy. Catherine continued her arrangement in the East Wing. The Phi then remained in the basement quarters, locked in at night, summoned during the day. More housemaids became pregnant under mysterious circumstances. Young Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, healthy and happy, doted on by his father and the entire household. Governor Fairmont's term ended in 1842, but he remained influential in Virginia politics, advising his successors and managing his bosom interests. He and Catherine continued to live in the governor's mansion as a courtesy from the new governor, a political ally who was happy to have the Fairmonts' continued presence and influence. To the outside world, the Fairmonts were a successful, respectable family. Thomas was a respected elder statesman. Catherine was a devoted mother and charitable society matron, and young Thomas Jr. W. as the pride of Richmond society. But inside the East Wing, the nightmare continued. In 1845, Daniel made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He couldn't endure the situation any longer. He had watched Marcus deteriorate, had seen the terror in the eyes of the women who were forced into the basement, had felt his own humanity being stripped away piece by piece. He had to do something. He had to try to get help, even if it meant risking everything. He managed to smuggle a letter out of the mansion. How he did it, no one ever knew for certain. Perhaps he bribed a delivery boy with a coin he had somehow acquired. Perhaps he slipped it into a merchant's cart when no one was looking. Perhaps he passed it to a sympathetic, free black person in the market during one of the rare OCC Asians when he was allowed outside under supervision. However he did it, a letter written in Daniel's careful handwriting reached the offices of the Richmond Enquirer, the city's most prominent newspaper. The letter was carefully worded. Daniel didn't mention Catherine by name, didn't mention the governor's mansion specifically, but he described in harrowing detail the experience of being held captive by a wealthy white woman who used enslaved men for her own purposes, who orchestrated forced encounters between enslaved people as if they were livestock, who kept them locked in basement rooms and threatened them with being sold south if they ever spoke of what happened. He described the psychological torture, the constant fear, the complete powerlessness. He described watching other enslaved people suffer and being unable to help them. He described the slow destruction of his own humanity, the way he felt himself becoming less than human under the weight of constant abuse. He ended the letter with a plea. I am writing this knowing that it may cost me my life, but I cannot remain silent any longer. Someone must know what is happening. Someone must bear witness. If you are reading Please know that we existed, that we suffered, that we were human beings who deserved better than what we received. Thomas Ritchie, the editor of the Richmond Enquirer, read the letter with growing horror. He was a respected journalist, a man who had built his career on reporting the truth, but he also understood the realities of Virginia society in 1845.
Slavery was legal, enshrined in law, and
Custom-enslaved people had no legal rights, no recourse, no way to seek justice. Their testimony was not admissible in court, and their experiences were not considered worthy of public concern. If he published this letter, what would happen? Would anyone believe it? Would it make any difference? Or would it simply cause a scandal that would destroy the newspaper's reputation and possibly put the letter writer in even greater danger? Ritchie wrestled with the decision for days. He showed the letter to his most trusted colleagues, and they debated what to do. Some argued that the letter should be published, that the truth needed to be told regardless of the consequences. Others argued that publishing it would be futile and dangerous, that it would accomplish nothing except to put the letter W. writer and possibly other enslaved people at risk. In the end, Ritchie made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He decided not to publish the letter, but he didn't destroy it either. He locked it in his desk drawer, where it would remain for decades, a piece of evidence too dangerous to reveal, but too important to discard. Daniel's attempt to seek help had consequences that he couldn't have anticipated. Catherine discovered the letter. How she found out about it, no one knew for certain. Perhaps someone at the newspaper mentioned it to her political contact, and word filtered back to the Fairmont circle. Perhaps one of the enslaved people in the mansion had seen Daniel writing and reported it, hoping to gain favor or avoid punishment. Perhaps Catherine simply noticed a change in Daniel's demeanor, a hint of defiance or hope, and investigated until she uncovered the truth. However, she found out her reaction was explosive. She summoned Daniel to her sitting room and confronted him with what she knew. She didn't have the letter itself, but she knew that he had written something, had tried to send it outside the mansion, had attempted to expose her. Catherine flew in, to a rage unlike anything the household had ever witnessed. She screamed at Daniel, called him ungrateful and treacherous, accused him of betraying her after all she had done for him. The other servants could hear her voice throughout the mansion, shrill and furious, and they cowered in their rooms, terrified of what would happen next. Daniel stood in the sitting room and took her abuse in silence. He had known that this might happen, had accepted the risk when he wrote the letter. He had hoped that the letter would reach someone who could help, but even if it didn't, at least he had tried. At least he had refused to remain silent. When Catherine finally exhausted herself with screaming, she made a decision. Daniel had to be removed immediately and permanently. He was too dangerous, too defiant, too likely to try again. She summoned 2 men from the Fairmont Plantation, overseers known for their brutality and their absolute loyalty to the Fairmont family. They arrived in Richmond the next day, and that night they took Daniel away. The official story was that Daniel had run away, that he had been caught by slave catchers in Petersburg and sold to a plantation in Alabama. But our 4 men in the basement quarters knew the truth, or at least suspected it. They had heard Daniel being dragged from his room in the middle of the night, had heard his muffled cries, had heard the sound of a wagon leaving the mansion grounds. They never saw Daniel again, and they never learned what happened to him. He simply disappeared, erased from the household records as if he had never existed. Daniel's disappearance had a profound effect on the remaining 4 men. If there had been any hope left in them, any thought of resistance or escape, it died with Daniel's removal. They understood now that Catherine's power was absolute, that there was no help coming, no way out. They could only endure and try to survive. Marcus, who had already been deteriorating, grew worse. He stopped speak entirely, even when directly addressed. He moved through his days like an automaton, performing his tasks with mechanical precision, but showing no sign of awareness or emotion. His eyes were empty, his face blank. He was a shell of a man, hollowed out by suffering. James, William, and Samuel watched Marcus's decline with growing dread. They could see themselves in him, could see their own futu, if they remained in the East Wing much longer. But what could they do? They were locked in at night, watched during the day, threatened with the sale of their families if they disobeyed. They were trapped, and they knew it. Catherine, meanwhile, seemed energized by Daniel's removal. She had eliminated a threat, had reasserted her control, had proven that she could make people disappear if they challenged her authority. She became more demanding, more capricious, more creative in her cruelties. She would summon the men at odd hours, keep them for entire nights, send them back to the basement quarters, exhausted and hollow-eyed. She began drinking more heavily, wine with dinner, brandy in the afternoon, whiskey late at night. Her hands shook. Her temper flared at the smallest provocation. Her mood swings became more extreme. Governor Fairmont, who had been largely oblivious to his wife's behavior, finally began to notice that something was wrong. Catherine was no longer the composed, charming woman who had been such an asset to his political career. She was erratic, volatile, often drunk. She neglected her social obligations, missed charity events, snapped at guests during politica. Dinners. Thomas suggested that Catherine see a doctor, take a rest cure, perhaps visit relatives in Charlottesville. Catherine refused violently, screaming that she was fine, that she just needed privacy, that everyone should leave her alone. Thomas, uncomfortable with his wife's intensity and relieved to have an excuse to avoid her, backed off. He spent more time at the plantation, more time in political meetings, more time anywhere but the governor's mansion. He told himself that Catherine was just going through a difficult phase, that she would recover in time, that it was best to give her space. But Catherine's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became paranoid, convinced that the servants were plotting against her, that people were talking about her, that everyone was trying to undermine her authority. She would interrogate the household staff about imagined infractions, accuse them of theft or laziness or insubordination, punish them for offenses that existed only in her mind. The atmosphere in the mansion became oppressive, fearful. The servants walked on eggshells, never knowing what would set Catherine off, what innocent action would be interpreted as defiance or disrespect. Several of them begged Governor Fairmont to intervene, to do something about his wife's behavior, but Thomas refused to get involved. Catherine's management of the household was her domain, and he had no intention of interfering. In the summer of 1847, Catherine made a decision that would prove fatal. She decided she wanted another child. She was 36 years old, and young Thomas was now Eve. She had successfully passed off one enslaved man's child as her husband's heir. Perhaps in her deteriorating mental state, she believed she could do it again. Or perhaps she simply wanted to recreate the one time in her life when she had felt powerful and successful, when she had achieved something that everyone had told her was impossible. She stopped drinking, began eating better, taking LKS in the mansion gardens. She attended church services again, smiled at social gatherings, played the role of devoted wife and mother. To the outside world, it seemed that Catherine was recovering, that whatever crisis she had been going through was over. But in the East Wing, she intensified her demands on the 4 remaining men. She summoned Marcus repeatedly, trying to recreate the circumstance. CES that had led to Thomas Jr.'s conception. But Marcus was too broken, too far gone. He could barely function, could barely respond to her demands. Catherine grew frustrated, then angry. She berated Marcus for his weakness, his uselessness, his failure to give her what she wanted. She punished him by locking him in his room for days at a time, by withholding food, by subjecting him to verbal abuse that was as cruel as any physical torture. In October 1847, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't endure anymore. He couldn't live with what he had become, with what he had been forced to do, with the knowledge that his son was growing up in the same house but would never know him. He couldn't live with the constant fear, the constant pain, the constant degradation. One night when the other men were asleep, Marcus took a rope from the storage area in the basement. He tied it to a ceiling beam in his room, fashioned a noose, stood on a chair, and stepped off. The other servants found him in the morning when he didn't respond to the bell. He was hanging from the beam, his body still and cold, his face peaceful for the first time in years. There was no note, no explanation, just a body swinging gently in the dim light of the basement. James, William, and Samuel stood in the doorway of Marcus's room and stared at his body, and they understood. Marcus had found the only escape available to him. He had chosen death over continued suffering, and none of them could blame him it. Catherine's reaction to Marcus's suicide was not grief or remorse. It was fury. She raged that Marcus had been weak, that he had been selfish, that he had ruined everything. She ordered his body removed immediately, buried in the slave cemetery, without ceremony or marker. She demanded that another man be brought from the plantation to replace him, as if Marcus were a broken tool that simply needed to be swapped out for a new one. But Governor Fairmont, who had returned to Richmond for a political dinner and been informed of the suicide, finally began asking questions. Why had Marcus been in the basement? Why were there separate rooms down there? Why did his wife keep these men isolated in the East Wing? What exactly was happening in his house? Thomas had ignored the whispers and rumor. Horace, for years, had convinced himself that whatever Catherine was doing was her own business, but a man had killed himself in the basement of the governor's mansion, and that couldn't be ignored. It was a scandal waiting to happen, and Thomas's political instincts finally overcame his willful blindness. He began investigating quietly and discreetly. He spoke to Joseph, his valet, who told him about the locked doors and the strange hours that the men in the basement kept. He spoke to Martha, the cook, who told him about the unusual food orders and the way Catherine treated the 5 men differently from other slaves. And finally, he spoke to Mrs. Dawes, who had been waiting for years for someone to ask the right questions. Mrs. Dawes showed Thomas her diary. She walked him through years of car. Eeful observations, dated entries, detailed accounts of what she had seen and heard. She told him about the pregnancies, the locked doors, the terror in the housemaid's eyes. She told him about Daniel's disappearance and the letter to the newspaper. She told him about Marcus's deterioration and the birthmark on young Thomas Jr., his shoulder. Thomas Fairmont read the diary with growing horror. He, W., is not a particularly moral man by modern standards. He owned over 100 slaves and had built his wealth on their labor. But even he was shocked by what his wife had done. The sexual abuse, the forced breeding, the psychological torture, the possibility that his own son was actually the child of an enslaved man. It was beyond anything he had imagined. But Thomas's primary concern was not the ring of the enslaved people in his household. It was the potential scandal if word got out about Catherine's arrangement. If the truth about young Thomas Jr.'s parentage became known, it would destroy the Fairmont name forever. Thomas would be a laughingstock. His political career would be over. His business interest would suffer. His family's reputation would be ruined. He had to contain the situation immediately and completely. On the evening of November 12, 1847, Thomas confronted Catherine in the East Wing. No one knows exactly what was said during that confrontation. The servants heard shouting, the crash of breaking glass, Catherine's voice rising to a shriek. They heard Thomas's voice cold and furious, demanding answers. They heard Catherine screaming that she had done nothing wrong, that the slaves were hers to do with as she pleased, that he had no right to judge her, that she had given him an heir when he couldn't give her one himself. And then suddenly, silence. The servants waited in the hallway, afraid to enter. Mrs. Dawes finally knocked on the door. There was no answer. She opened it slowly. Catherine Fairmont was lying on the floor of her sitting room, her face purple, her eyes bulging, her hands clawed at her throat. She was dead. Governor Fairmont stood over her, his face ashen, his hands shaking. She collapsed, he said harshly. She was screaming, and then she just collapsed. Her heart, I think, or apoplexy, she just fell. Mrs. Dawes looked at Catherine's body, at the broken glass on the floor, at the overturned furniture. She looked at Thomas's hand. DS, which bore no marks of violence, and at Catherine's throat, which showed no signs of strangulation, it was possible that Catherine had died of apoplexy brought on by extreme emotion. It was also possible that Thomas had helped her along, though there was no evidence of it. "I'll send for the doctor," Mrs. Dawes said quietly. The doctor arrived within the hour. He was a discreet man who had served Virginia's elite for decades, and he understood what was expected of him. He examined Catherine's body briefly and declared the cause of death to be apoplexy brought on by nervous excitement. It was a convenient diagnosis, vague enough to be unverifiable, respectable enough to avoid scandal, and plausible enough that no one would question it. Catherine was buried 3 days later in Hollywood. Cemetery in the Henley family plot. The funeral was well attended by Richmond society. The newspapers printed glowing obituaries praising her charity work and devotion to her family. No one mentioned the East Wing or the 5 men or the secrets that had died with her, but Thomas Fairmont knew that the danger wasn't over. There were still 3 enslaved men who knew everything. There was Mrs.
Dawes in her diary.
There were the housemates who had been forced into the basement rooms. There was the letter in Thomas Ritchie's desk. There was young Thomas Jr. with his telltale birthmark. Thomas acted swiftly and ruthlessly to eliminate every trace of the scandal. The 3 remaining men from the basement quarters, James, William, and Samuel, were sold to a slave trader within a week of Catherine's death. The trader specialized in the Deep South market, and the 3 men were transported to Louisiana, where they disappeared into the vast plantation system.
Thomas made sure they were sold to different owners in different parishes,
ensuring they would never see each other again and never have the opportunity to tell their story together. The housemaids who had been forced into the basement were also sold, scattered across Virginia and the Corollas, separated from their families and communities, silenced by distance and fear. Mrs. Dawes was offered a generous sum of money, more money than she had ever seen in her life, and a letter of recommendation to a family in Philadelphia. The unspoken message was clear: take the money, leave Virginia, and never speak of what you saw. Mrs. Dawes, practical and aware of how precarious her position was, accepted. She took her diary with her, hidden in her trunk, and left Richmond on a cold December morning. She would live in Philadelphia for the rest of her life, and she would never speak publicly about what she had witnessed in the governor's mansion. Thomas then did something extraordinary. He called an emergency meeting of the Virginia General Assembly's leadership, men he had worked with for years, men who owed him favors, men who understood that the reputation of Virginia's political class was a
stake.
He told them everything, not because he felt guilty or wanted to confess, but because he needed their help to bury the scandal completely. The legislators were shocked, disgusted, and terrified. If this story became public, it would be a disaster, not just for the Fairmont family, but for all of them. It would fuel abolitionist propaganda in the North, damage Virginia's reputation, raise uncomfortable questions about what happened in the private quarters of the wealthy and powerful, and potentially inspire enslaved people to resist or rebel. They made a decision. The East Wing of the governor's mansion would be closed, renovated, and repurposed. All records related to the enslaved people who had worked there would be lost in a convenient filing error. The household staff would be replaced entirely with new servants who knew nothing of the previous arrangements, and everyone who had attended the meeting would sign a confidentiality agreement binding them to silence for 100 years. The agreement was signed on December 3, 1847. It was witnessed by a notary and locked in the state archives with instructions that it was not to be opened until December 3, 1947. But Thomas was, and finished. He wanted to eliminate every physical trace of what had happened in the East Wing. On the night of December 15, 1847, a fire broke out in the East Wing of the governor's mansion. It started in Catherine's former sitting room and spread rapidly, consuming the entire wing before the fire brigade could contain it. The official report blamed faulty chimney construction, but the servant whispered that Thomas had set it himself, determined to destroy every trace of what his wife had done. The fire destroyed Catherine's sitting room, her bedroom, her library, and the private staircase that led to the basement quarters. The heat was so intense that it cracked the foundation and caused part of the basement to collapse. When the ruins were cleared away, Thomas ordered the basement queue, orders filled in with brick and mortar, sealed off as if they had never existed. The East Wing was rebuilt in 1848 with a completely different layout. The new rooms bore no resemblance to Catherine's private apartments. It was as if that entire section of the mansion had been erased from history. Thomas Ritchie, the newspaper editor who had received Daniel's letter, kept it in his desk until his death in 1854. His son found it while going through his father's papers, and after reading it, made the same decision his father had. It was too dangerous to publish, but too important to destroy. The letter passed through 3 generations of the Ritchie family before being donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1921, where it was filed away unread in a box of miscellaneous correspondence. Mr. Dores lived in Philadelphia until her death in 1869. Her diary was found among her possessions by her granddaughter, who was horrified by its contents but also recognized its historical importance. She donated it anonymously to the Library of Congress in 1903, where it sat in the manuscript collection uncatalogued and unexamined for decades. Thomas Fairmont lived until 1856, dying of pneumonia at
the age of 60.
He took his secrets to the grave, and his obituaries praised him as a statesman and a pillar of Virginia society. His son, Thomas Jr., grew up to be a Confederate officer, dying at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 at the age of 20. He never knew the truth about his parentage, and the birthmark on his shoulder was noted in his military medical records as a distinguishing mark, crescent, shaped left shoulder. The 3 men who were sold to Louisiana, James, William, and Samuel, left no records of their later lives. They disappeared into the anonymity of slavery, their names appearing in ledgers and bills of sale, but never in any document that recorded their voices, their experiences, or their fates. If they survived until emancipation in 1865, there is no record of it. If they IED to return to Virginia to tell their story, no one documented it. They simply vanished from history as if they had never existed. Marcus was buried in the slave cemetery behind the Fairmont Plantation in Hanover County. The cemetery was abandoned after the Civil War, and by the 1920s it had been swallowed by forest. In 1968, a developer clearing land for a housing subdivision discovered the CE tree and was required by law to relocate the remains. Marcus's grave was identified by a crude wooden marker that had somehow survived with his name and the year 1847 carved into it. His remains were moved to a public cemetery where they lie today under a small stone that reads simply Marcus D., 1847. Daniel's fate remains unknown. There is no record of him being sold to Alabama, no record of him arriving at any plantation in the Deep South, no record of what happened to him after he was taken from the governor's mansion in the middle of the night. He simply disappeared, and his disappearance remains one of the many mysteries surrounding the scandal. The truth about Catherine Fairmont remained hidden for over a century. The confidentiality agreement kept the legislators silent until 1947, and by then most of them were dead. The diary and the letter sat in archives unread and uncatalogued. The physical evidence had been destroyed in the fire. The witnesses had been scattered or silenced. It was a perfect cover-up, and it might have remained hidden forever if not for a series of coincidences. In 1952, a graduate student at the University of Virginia named Robert Hayes was researching Virginia political history for his dissertation. He was looking for information about household management in the Antebellum South, and he spent weeks in the Library of Congress manuscript collection going through boxes of old letters and diaries. He almost missed Mrs. Dors's diary. It was in a box labeled Miscellaneous Household Records, 19th Century, and it had never been properly cataloged. But hey, S was thorough, and he opened every box, examined every document. When he started reading the diary, he thought at first that it must be fiction, some kind of Gothic novel or sensationalist story. But as he read further, he realized that it was too detailed, too specific, too grounded in verifiable facts to be fiction. Mrs. Dawes had recorded dates, names, events that could be cross-referenced with other historical documents. Hayes brought the diary to his advisor, Professor Margaret Chen, who was stunned by its contents. Together, they began to investigate, cross-referencing the diary with other historical records. They found the sealed General Assembly records in the Virginia State Archives, which had been opened in 1947 as stipulated by the confidentiality agreement. The records confirm that an emergency meeting had been held in December 1847, that a confidentiality agreement had been signed, and that the subject of the meeting had been a matter of extreme delicacy involving the former governor's household. They found Daniel's letter in the Virginia Historical Society archives, filed away in a box of miscellaneous correspondence. The letter was dated 1845, and it described Expery. NCEs that matched what Mrs. Dawes had recorded in her diary. They found property records showing the sale of enslaved people from the Fairmont household in late 1847. 5 men and 3 women, all sold within 2 weeks of Catherine Fairmont's death. They found the fire report from December 1847, which noted that the fire had started in the East Wing and had been unusually intense, almost as if it been deliberately set. They found Catherine's death certificate, which listed the cause of death as apoplexy. They found the household ledger from the governor's mansion, which showed that 5 men had been transferred from the Fairmont plantation to the mansion in May 1840, and that they had been assigned to work exclusively in the East Wing. Everything matched, every detail in Mrs. Dawes's deed. Eyre was corroborated by other historical documents. The scandal was real. Hayes wrote his dissertation on the subject, and it was published as a book in 1955, The Hidden Quarters, Sexual Exploitation, and Power in Antebellum, Virginia. The book caused a minor stir in academic circles, with some historians praising Hayes for uncovering an important and disturbing chapter of American history, and O.T. Hers criticizing him for sensationalism or for drawing conclusions that went beyond the evidence. The Fairmont family, by then scattered and no longer politically prominent, did not respond to requests for comment. Most of them probably didn't even know about the scandal. It had been buried so thoroughly that even family members had forgotten it. But Hayes's book opened the door for further research. Other historians began investigating similar cases, looking for evidence of sexual exploitation of enslaved men by white women. They discovered that while such cases were rare, they were not unique. There were other documented instances recorded in private letters and diaries of wealthy white women who used their power over enslaved men in disturbing ways. The power dynamics of slavery created opportunities for abuse that went far beyond the well-documented sexual violence of white men against enslaved women. White women, though constrained by the patriarchal society they lived in, still held absolute power over enslaved people. And some of them used that power in ways that were hidden, denied, and erased from official history. In 1967, a historian named Dr. Patricia Williams published a comprehensive study titled Hidden Abuses, Gender, Power, and Sexual Exploitation in the Antebellum South. The book examined dozens of cases similar to Catherine Fairmont's, drawn from private letters, diaries, court records, and oral histories collected from the descendants of enslaved people. Williams argued that the sexual exploitation of enslaved men by white women was far more common than previously believed, but that it had been systematically erased from historical memory because it contradicted the prevailing narratives about both slavery and gender. The scandal of Catherine Fairmont was exceptional, not because it was unique, but because it was documented. Most such cases left no trace. Protected by the same forces that protected Catherine, social pressure, political power, and illegal invisibility of enslaved people whose testimony was not admissible in court and whose experiences were not considered worthy of record. Today, the governor's mansion in Richmond still stands, though it has been renovated and expanded many times since 1847. It serves as the official residence of Virginia's governors, and it is also open for public tours. Tourists walk through its elegant rooms, admiring the period furniture and the portraits of Virginia's governors. There is no plaque mentioning Catherine Fairmont, no marker indicating where the East Wing once stood, no acknowledgement of the 5 men who were held captive in the basement. But if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the original structure. In the basement, there are sections of brick wall that are slightly different in color from the surrounding walls, the places where the separate quarters were filled in and sealed. In the Virginia State Archives, there are gaps in the household records for the governor's mansion between 1840 and 1847, pages that were removed or lost. And in the slave cemetery records for Hanover County, there is a notation for Marcus with the cause of death listed as
murder, a term that appears nowhere else in the ledger.
The story of Catherine Fairmont raises questions that have no easy answers. How many other women in positions of power exploited those beneath them in ways that were never recorded? How many enslaved people suffered abuses that were so taboo, so unthinkable that even other slaves couldn't speak of them? How many secrets were buried under silence, protected by confidentiality agreements and convenient fires? And perhaps most disturbingly, if Mrs. Dawes hadn't kept her diary, if Daniel hadn't written his letter, if Robert Hayes hadn't stumbled across these documents by chance, would we ever have known this happened at all? The historical record is full of silences, gaps where uncomfortable truths should be. The scandal of Catherine Fairmont survived only because a few people refused to let it disappear completely, even when doing so put them at risk. Mrs. Dawes documented what she saw, even though she knew that speaking out could cost her everything. Daniel wrote his letter, even though he knew it might cost him his life. Thomas Ritchie kept the letter, even though publishing it could have destroyed his newspaper. And Robert Hayes pursued the truth, even though some of his colleagues warned him that the subject was too controversial, too disturbing, too likely to damage his academic career. They preserved the truth because they believed that what happened in the East Wing of the governor's mansion mattered, that the suffering of Marcus and James and William and Daniel and Samuel mattered, that the terror of Patience and the other housemaids mattered. They believed that history should record not just the grand political events and the lives of the powerful, but also the hidden abuses, the secret cruelties, the suffering of those who had no voice. What do you think of this story? Was the truth ever fully exposed, or do sealed archives still hide details no one was meant to find? How many semi? Large scandals were buried just as carefully. No Mrs. Dawes to remember, no Daniel to leave behind a letter, no Robert Hayes willing to pull at the threads until everything unraveled? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this forgotten chapter of American history stayed with you and you want more stories drawn from lost records and suppressed truths, subscribe to Vintage Truths, turn on Notify. And share this video with someone who's drawn to historical mysteries. Until the next story, some truths refuse to stay buried.